Gary Chapman relates the words of a young man called Mark, who had just started his first full-time job and was contemplating getting married. He said the following: "I think the thing that made me feel most loved was the way my parents worked so hard to help me with everything." And as he remembered back to his younger years, he recalled the specifics. He said, "I remember all the meals that Mom made, even though she worked outside the home. At the time, Dad helped me with the second-hand car that we had bought together when I first got my driver's license. The little things, the big things, they did so much to help me." And now at the age of 24, Mark continued to reminisce. He said, I realize it now more than I did back then. But even at the time, I knew that they were working hard to help me, and I always appreciated it. I hope I can do the same for my children one day." Mark was describing his parents who throughout his life had adeptly spoken the love language of service. Gary Chapman writes that parenting is a service-oriented vocation. He says that the day you decide to have a child, you enroll for long-term service. And he says that by the time your child has become a teenager, you have been speaking this love language for 13 years. And if, as a parent, you really want to have a sense of the hours, days, months, and years of service that you have given, take a few minutes and calculate the number of nappies you may have changed, meals prepared, clothes washed, folded and ironed, the number of band-aids you have applied, toys you have repaired, sheets you have tucked in, hair you have washed and combed, perhaps the number of miles you have driven all over the countryside, taking your children this way and that. He suggests that on days when parents may be feeling like a failure, such a list may provide solid and irrefutable evidence that you have indeed loved your children. The same exercise could also be done in reverse. It might be equally possible for us to make a list of all that we have received from our parents in the earliest years of our lives, throughout our childhood, into our teens, as well as the ongoing love and support that we have received from them into our adult years. Gary Chapman goes on to say that all of this hard work takes on a dimension of nobility when you understand that such acts of service are powerful expressions of emotional love. History is full of examples of men and women who learn to speak this love language known as acts of service, and the list includes people like Mother Teresa, Albert Schweitzer, Mohandas Gandhi, more recently someone like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, last year here in the UK, Prince Philip. This year in the UK, many people will be celebrating the years of public service that the Queen has given to the people of the United Kingdom, as well as the Commonwealth. I was interested that in a letter written by the Queen that was shown on TV, on the news just a few days ago, she had signed the letter as your servant. Indeed, one of the signs of true greatness is expressed in serving. When reading off a list of great names in history who have given their lives in service of others, it's easy to forget that millions of parents all around the world have lived equally noble and self-sacrificing lives for the sake of their children. Lives of true greatness, and yet unseen, unacknowledged, with no public accolades or medals of honor. If true greatness is indeed expressed in serving, then many, many parents have participated in this work of true greatness, as their acts of service freely given have been true expressions of emotional love. Gary Chapman gives a reminder, though, that loving service of this kind is freely given. He writes that loving service is not slavery. Slavery is imposed from the outside, it's done with reluctance. Instead, loving service is a gift, not a necessity, and it is done freely and not under coercion. When service is done with a spirit of resentment and bitterness, then the spirit of love is tainted, and it is no longer nourishing or helpful for those who are on the receiving end. It is important for all of us, when engaging in acts of service, to be sure that our acts of service are truly communicating love, or perhaps instead whether our actions have become tainted with toxic emotions that harm not just those who are recipients but also ourselves as the givers, poisoning ourselves and our relationships with negativity and darkness, rather than being expressions of the purity of divine love. Another reminder that Gary Chapman gives is that manipulation is not love. When acts of service are used as a means of manipulating another person, then the streams of love flowing between us again become tainted and polluted. We are practicing manipulation if our acts of service are always tied to somebody else doing something for us in return. As Gary Chapman writes, manipulation is never an expression of love. Love cannot be earned. It is a gift, freely expressed. True love is always without conditions. But that doesn't mean that sometimes it might not be necessary perhaps to set boundaries in relationships. And perhaps also where other people might need to be confronted or called to account. But if our acts of service are to be truly loving, then they need to be given without manipulation and without hidden agenda. Manipulation, as Gary Chapman writes, has nothing to do with love and everything to do with control. As Christians, the supreme example of a life of loving service is in fact Jesus, and many would agree that the simple act of washing his disciples' feet in John chapter 13 represents a profound summary and a symbol of the way Jesus lived his whole life. He himself said that he did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life for the sake of others. And he went on to teach his followers, whoever wants to become great among you must become your servant. In the story of Jesus washing his disciples' feet, we read of the actions that Jesus took on that night. Firstly, we read that Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. Jesus' acts of service come from a positive place within him. They come from an inner knowing that he is already loved. Knowing himself to be loved, Jesus is able to freely share that love with others. He is not doing this act of service to try and win over the love of his disciples, secure in the knowledge that he is already loved. He is able to freely share that love without any sense of manipulation. Secondly, we read that he got up from the meal. Acts of service require effort. It takes effort to get up from the table. It's much easier just to sit and wait for others to do things for us. Acts of service require some initiative on our part and the effort to get up ready to act. Thirdly, we read that Jesus took off his outer clothing, his outer garment. And in a way, this is symbolic of the fact that when we engage in acts of service, it requires that we take off our sense of self-importance. The Apostle Paul in Colossians uses the imagery of removing a garment as a symbol of taking off what he calls the old self. The self that is filled with manipulative desires and greed, anger, rage, and malice. Fourthly, We read that Jesus then wrapped a towel around his waist. Again, this might have symbolic value for us, just as we need to take off our sense of self-importance, to take off that old self. So Paul speaks of putting on the new self that is being renewed in knowledge and in the image of its creator. In Colossians 3 verse 12 he says, "Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. And over all these, put on love." Jesus wrapping a towel around his waist becomes a symbol of the fact that a true act of service needs to be clothed or wrapped in love. And fifthly, we read that Jesus poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Acts of service requires a kind of pouring ourselves out towards others. It's a reminder that unless we have some love in our love tanks, we will have nothing to pour out. If loving acts of service are to be protected from becoming acts of manipulation or tainted with resentment and bitterness, we need to make sure that our love tanks or our love basins have something in them that we can pour out. True acts of service therefore require also acts of self-care. Otherwise, we will end up with nothing left to give. As suggested in this sermon, all of us, if we are to be fully mature human beings, need to learn this language of love, of loving and kind acts of service towards others. A life that is unwilling to give itself in service to others is ultimately an immature life of self-centeredness. When Paul speaks in 1 Corinthians 13, that passage where he talks about love, he also says he talks about having put aside childish ways. I believe in speaking like that, he's not speaking about putting aside a sense of childlike joy and exuberance, but rather he is speaking of the need that each of us has to grow out of a self-centered preoccupation. Psychology reminds us that babies and young children are naturally narcissistic. When we are born into the world, as babies, we all have the sense that the world revolves around us. The terrible twos, as I understand them, represent that period in a child's life when they begin to come to the dreadful realization that the world does not in fact revolve around them, and that they can't always simply get what they want. Part of putting aside these narcissistic childish ways requires that all of us learn to speak this language of service, of love. It's one of the dangers of growing up in too much wealth. One has a sense of entitlement, that the world is here to serve us, whereas Jesus shows us that the path to true maturity and true greatness lies in the opposite direction. While we all need to learn this language of loving service, for some people, it is their primary language of love. The primary way in which they express love to others and to the world, doing acts of kindness towards others, going out of their way to be helpful and to be of service. And the danger is that the rest of us may take advantage of them and forget that if this is their primary language of love, then we also need to learn to speak this language of love in return. In closing, who are those in your life who have gone out of their way in loving acts of service towards you, and who have blessed you with this language of love, of acts of kindness, giving themselves unconditionally to you, serving you without conditions or the hope of getting back anything in return? And in what way might you, out of love and gratitude, perhaps speak this love language back to them in return? Amen.